Hi, my name's Keir. I'm an employment and litigation lawyer for Keir, Steele, Waldon lawyers, and I'm going to speak today about COVID-19 virus and how you can best prepare as an employer. As everyone knows, the situation is changing day by day, hour by hour. So the information that we're receiving as lawyers is also changing as the situation evolves. Today I'll be discussing employers' obligations, specifically their workplace health and safety obligations and also their obligations under the Fair Work Act. To start off with the workplace health and safety obligations, these are actually the overarching and most important obligations that an employer has, and that primary obligation is to ensure the health and safety of employees in the workplace. This includes providing and maintaining a safe work environment that's without risk to health and safety, and adequate facilities for workers to carry out their work so far as reasonably practicable. And that's a note that I'll be referring to throughout this presentation. Is you can only do what is reasonably practical in the workplace. There's no expectation that risk is completely eliminated. It's simply that you do whatever you can to minimise that risk. So the current advice from the Department of Health to eliminate or minimise risk means that you must immediately implement controls, measures, and communicate those controls and measures to all staff. So at present, those controls and measures will include things like advising staff to stay away from the workplace if they're sick, or if they're exhibiting symptoms of a cold or flu, or they're in immediate contact with somebody who has developed the COVID-19 virus or that they suspect has developed the virus. So make sure staff know they should advise their management as soon as possible. Employers need to advise employees about what symptoms they should be looking out for, which, as I just said, is cold and flu-like symptoms. Employees should be providing a point of contact to discuss their concerns. This is usually, obviously, a manager or direct supervisor. Employers should be taking additional health and safety precautions themselves, providing extra hand sanitizer, soap. I know that's difficult at this stage when those supplies are limited, but it's important that the employer is seen to be doing everything that's possible to minimise the risk in the workplace. And also, employers should be reminding employees that they have their own personal obligations to ensure the health and safety of themselves and their colleagues as well. If employers haven't already, this advice should be sent in a staff email to all employees, and employers should be sending regular updates via email, preferably to all employees, as the situation develops. In terms of working from home, this is something that's going to be increasingly necessary as the virus develops and as more people meet the criteria of requiring quarantine. So it's important that employers right now take measures and steps to ensure that they're ready to support their staff in working from home. That includes making sure staff have access to the appropriate computers, telephones, support, administrative support where possible, and those steps should be taken now to avoid confusion or delay in terms of, and also to avoid downturn in business or lost time in business. Another thing that employers should be mindful of is that their workplace health and safety obligations apply even when staff are working from home. So an employer's obligation to provide a safe workplace for their employees will still apply when employees are working from home. For workplaces that have high client contact, it's worthwhile to start considering limiting that client contact now, whether that be by conducting customer or client contact via telephone or video link or Skype, and advising clients in advance or customers in advance that that will be how business goes for the next few weeks or months. Clients will be happy that you're taking those extra precautions to protect their health and to protect their family's health. What should you do now if you have a staff member who is sick or has a cough and cold, your overarching obligation is to protect the health and safety of your employees. There's currently nothing in the Workplace Health and Safety Act that gives you the right to direct staff to stay at home. However, as an employer, you have to make that decision as to what's in the best interest of your employees' health and safety. And if that includes making the decision to direct a staff member to stay at home, you should be doing that. This is important to eliminate risk and obviously look after everybody's health and safety. Keep in mind that when you have staff members who are sick or ill or present sick or ill at work, you still have workers' compensation obligations, which means that if a worker becomes ill or injured in the course of their employment, and that is directly related to their employment, you could be liable for a work cover claim. So at this stage, it's difficult. There's no current cases of anyone submitting a work cover claim for having contracted coronavirus at work, and it will be difficult for a person or an employee to prove that that they did contract the virus from work, but it's still something to be mindful of in terms of your workplace health and safety obligations. As I've already said, this advice is changing so rapidly that it's important to make sure that you keep up to date with the latest advice from the Department of Health and also the relevant workplace health and safety bodies to make sure that you're up to date and that you feed that information through to employees and keep them updated and notified as the situation changes. Now I'm going to talk about the obligations for an employer under the Fair Work Act. Presently, I've seen a lot of confusion in relation to the advice that employers are receiving in respect of what their obligations are in terms of employees who either are directed to quarantine or who elect to self-quarantine. From the outset, I should say that this advice is very general advice and the circumstances will change or differ depending on the employee's particular employment contract, the award that they're under, or their enterprise agreement. So those provisions have to be kept in mind when determining what entitlements an employee is entitled to. I'll first clarify that in most cases, a casual employee is not entitled to sick leave or annual leave. So the advice that I'll provide is generally in relation to permanent and part-time employees. From the outset, if an employee has contracted coronavirus or is experiencing flu-like symptoms, they're entitled to the usual sick leave entitlements, and the usual process regarding sick leave will apply. If an employee is required to self-quarantine but is not actually sick themselves, employers are encouraged to work flexibly with staff, and that means where possible offering sick leave, annual leave or other entitlements. If and where possible an employee is required to self-quarantine and they are able to work from home, employers should consider that as an option, and obviously where an employee works from home, that they are entitled to their wages as per usual. If an employee is not able to work from home, the law does differ depending on whether or not an employee has elected to self-quarantine or if they have been directed by their employer to quarantine. The advice from peak employer industry is that if an employee elects to self-quarantine and they are not actually sick themselves or caring for a sick person, the hardline view is that they are strictly not entitled to take sick leave or annual leave. However, we encourage where possible employers to work with their employees to make sure that a flexible arrangement that suits both parties is worked on. However, if an employer directs an employee to stay at home and the employee is technically not sick themselves, in some cases an employer will be required to pay their staff wages. The relevant provision that deals with this type of situation occurring is the stand-down provisions in the Fair Work Act. The stand-down provisions state that an employer may stand down an employee during a period in which the employee cannot usefully be employed because of one of the following circumstances: A, industrial action; B, a breakdown of machinery or equipment; and C, a stoppage of work for any cause for which the employer cannot be held reasonably responsible. Historically, subclause C is used for those events such as natural disasters or inclement weather, and it's not yet 100% certain how that clause will apply to a situation like the current pandemic that we're facing. However, I can confirm that the current advice from the Fair Work Ombudsman is that standing down employees without pay is not generally available due to a deterioration of business conditions or because an employee has the coronavirus. Now, the advice with respect to this will very much depend on the individual situation and the employee's contract and the award that applies to the employee. If you do experience a downturn of business and you are required to let staff go, the usual redundancy provisions will apply. So this is why we think that communication with your employees is so important. Most employees will appreciate and understand that if there is a stand down situation, there will need to be flexibility on behalf of both the employer and the employee to make sure that the business has longevity and can see things through until the situation is under control. So that's a snapshot of issues from the HR and the workplace health and safety perspective. But if I can just touch on a couple of matters that may arise over the next few weeks and months in simply a business perspective or a commercial litigation perspective. It's important that employers don't assume that this pandemic overrides general contractual rights. The timeframes that are imposed at this stage on your business or the businesses that you deal with will still apply. This is why it's important that if you do need an extension in terms of responding to particular agencies or clients or paying bills or invoices, then it's important to discuss these beforehand and before the situation arises with those various parties. Communication is key throughout this whole process. So what we advise is to get on the front foot when it comes to dealing with suppliers and clients. Don't assume that there will be any automatic extensions to timeframes, and where possible, certain contracts may have provisions for force majeure provisions within the contract. Those provisions might be able to be applied during the current pandemic. So it's important, as I've said, to make sure that as an employer you keep on top of the relevant notifications from the Fair Work Ombudsman in particular, and also the relevant Australian health authorities as well, and keep the communication going with your employees because, as the Prime Minister said, you'll need them at the other side of this. If employers do require any specific information in relation to their obligations, feel free to contact Keir, Steele, Waldon lawyers for further advice. Thanks.